Hey, this is Tiffany. Hope you're doing well. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the early funeral and burial practices of the Hebrew culture. And first, I'd just like to start off by defining the word pagan, which is used in our text. That just means that's someone holding religious beliefs other than those that are recognized in the current times. So with that said, the resemblance of many pagan funeral customs to contemporary practices suggests that modern Western funeral traditions have their origins in ancient non-Christian sources. Now, while there are certainly connections between them, according to our textbook, some similarities are just coincidental. The fundamental concepts underpinning current Western funeral practices are rooted primarily in Judeo-Christian mortuary beliefs. Now, specific rituals and practices within this framework developed due to the emergence of sects and denominations and were even further influenced by local and national customs, fashions, and even whims. Nevertheless, the core ideological basis of Christian orientation towards the deceased and the provisions for their disposition still remain largely unchanged today. Now, what about the funeral practices in early Hebrew culture? Well, specifically regarding their death beliefs, like other Semitic peoples, early Hebrews thought of humans as composed of only two elements: basar, translating into flesh, akin to the flesh of slaughtered animals, and nefesh, meaning the breath of life, or a spirit-like substance residing within the flesh, specifically the blood. At death, the flesh returned to dust, while the breath of the or spirit persisted, and Hebrews believed the dead retains significant powers of thought and feeling, as well as certain supernatural abilities like possessing stones, images, or human bodies. Now, the ghosts of the deceased resembled their former selves in appearance and behavior, though they were more shadowy and diminished versions. Now, similar to other Semites, Hebrews believed the soul maintained a connection with the body, suffering when the corpse was harmed, and they generally held that the soul led a shadowy afterlife in another realm called the field. Now, this belief emerged later as specific cults emphasized the spirit's return to their grave or to their previous residence. And by the end of the Babylonian captivity, monotheism had developed as an organized belief system centered around Yahweh, excluding other primitive forms of worship. Now, early Hebrew death beliefs didn't view the soul as entirely separate from the body, as the close relationship between the blood, the flesh, the spirit, and Yahweh made this separation difficult to conceive. Earlier resurrection concepts suggested that the breath or spirit would reanimate the body, kind of like the Egyptian beliefs. And by about 150 BC, after the Persian and Greek domination, Hebrew death beliefs evolved to include the idea that upon death, righteous souls entered a blessed existence and wicked souls faced punishment. And both would be resurrected at the final judgment to receive their ultimate rewards or punishments. Now, in regard to the burial customs, immediately after death, the eyes and the mouth of the deceased were closed, and the body was washed and anointed with fragrant spices and dressed in its finest attire. In the very early days, the body was bound in the position of an unborn child. And by the time of Christ, the body was wrapped in linen after being washed and anointed with spices, a practice that seems to have developed later since it's not actually mentioned in the Old Testament. The Jewish belief that the dead could be recognized by their garments in the underworld suggests that they were probably buried in their customary daily apparel. And according to the ancient practice described by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, Jewish officials and kings were buried with spices, ornaments, and precious metals. Now, burial typically occurred on the day of the death or the evening of that day of the death due to hygienic necessity. And in the warm climate of Palestine, putrefaction began very quickly and spread rapidly. So the early Hebrews buried their dead without coffins, which those came into use after the Babylonian captivity. So the body was then taken to the burial site on a bier, and when they reached the grave, the poor were laid on the ground or in a shallow trench covered with a mound of earth. But the wealthy were interred in natural caves or artificial sepulchres carved from a rock. So this concludes today's awesome video retracing our riveting funeral history facts of other cultures. Thanks for your time, and goodbye now.